Okay, well, take it away, guys. Um, maybe I'll kind of set the stage a little bit. So last time we talked, well, okay, so 2 times ago we talked about substance versus process ontology. Uh,
Mhm.
and so, some of that comes back here. But then last time we read the opening of this and we developed the idea of process ontology with respect to intuition. All right, so it's not just that Bergson thinks that the fundamental reality is, motion or process or change or whatever, but there's a particular sort of access that we have to that, uh, which he calls intuition. And he sets that against analysis, which is typically taken to be perhaps a more formal approach to understanding. And one thing he says and starts to develop here a little bit, although actually there was an earlier book called Matter and Memory where he develops this a little bit more in more detail, but he's trying to suggest a methodology of intuition, right? So, typically, I mean, if you just think about the kind of common usage of the word intuition, it's touchy and feely and fuzzy, and certainly not clear and distinct in a Cartesian sense, right? In the way that a mathematical formula, if you solve it, gives you exactly one answer, right?
Mhm.
Intuition is often taken to be something a lot less distinct than that. That's the common usage. There's also the philosophical usage, which is that intuition is that mode of apprehending reality that is immediate.
Mhm.
That's the way that people like John Locke and Kant and a number of other people in the tradition of modern philosophy use that word intuition. It's the difference between, say, knowing all of the uh, various laws of physics and boundary conditions that give rise to the perception of blue on a theoretical level
Mhm.
and knowing what it's like to see blue.
Yeah.
Right. So the second of those is intuitive, or, it's just this sort of what Russell calls knowledge by acquaintance,
Mm.
not knowledge through some kind of conceptual analysis or theoretical analysis, right? And so intuition has often been taken to be either really fuzzy and indistinct or whatever, or so close to our apprehension of the world that it's sort of impossible to analyze it. I think a few times ago I made the metaphor of trying to see your own eyes
Yeah.
from the inside. That's sort of what it's like to analyze intuition, right? Because intuition is either just immediate and not the sort of thing like when I move my arm, it's not like I could then give you a complete physiognomical account of everything that needs to happen in order for me to move my arm. Or, that would also include like neuronal activity and, you know, uh, physical laws and all sorts of things, right? Or maybe an even better example. This is one that I like. You throw a ball or a frisbee in the air and your dog runs up and catches it. If you're going to give a theoretical account of that, you would have a blackboard full of equations,
Yeah.
but the dog doesn't have those equations in its brain, in its mind when it's catching the frisbee, right? At
Mhm.
least, I mean, it's pretty unlikely. It's very implausible that it does. Um, so then how does it do it, right? Are those equations actual properties of that action, or are they a theoretical account of what's happening? Right. It seems like the dog is able
Exactly.
to do it through some kind of intuitive knowledge. But again, dogs are kind of a interesting boundary case just because they're probably minimally conscious or even minimally self-conscious. But there are all sorts of almost certainly unconscious uh, life forms, amoebas or whatever, that nonetheless have purposive activity, right? They are attracted or repelled by certain things. They seek nourishment, food, they reproduce, etc., right? Um, and they do all of that without even the minimum of any kind of awareness, as far as we can tell. These, really simple life forms. So, seems evident that there's a sort of way of describing intuition that is not even necessarily aware, right? Um, and to the extent that it's aware, that we're aware of our intuition, it's sort of like us being aware of the fact that we are engaged in uh, a network of physical laws or whatever. Well, laws are a tricky thing because laws are often taken to be a mental representation of regularities,
Yeah.
right? So things happen over and over and over again. Are they laws in the sense that a law would be appealed to in a theoretical explanation? Uh, that's a little bit hard to say, but the idea is that um, the fact that we're aware intuitively of things suggests simply that we're aware of being subject to whatever sorts of relationships are there in the mind independent world, right?
Hmm.
Way of making the mind independent world an object to us,
Hmm.
right? So intuition has traditionally had that sort of range of denotations. Uh, then what Bergson is trying to do is make it methodological so that it's no longer the sort of thing where it's so close that there's nothing you can say about it. I suppose, to be fair, ultimately there is nothing you can say about it. You just know. But it's the sort of thing that you can try to mm, actually, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, often talks about intuition pumps,
Hmm.
right? That's his word for thought experiments,
Hmm.
intuition pumps. And those things can pump your intuition, like they can get it to go, they can get it starting, right? Like when Bergson talks about, um, let's see, what's a positive account he gives of intuition? He gives a lot of negative accounts, what intuition is not, the way that the accumulation of concepts doesn't get you to intuition. You just kind of have to know already. But I'm trying to remember if he has any positive metaphors for intuition. Um,
Don't, um, yeah, I'm halfway through it and I don't think I've encountered, um, yeah, because he pits empiricism and rationalism, right, against each other and says like
yeah,
how,
that's a bit later. But even before that, we would think that he must have, because he's got a lot of very evocative metaphorical language. Um, it just seems
there's
that almost all of the metaphors he uses describe intuition negatively.
there is one where he says when I look inside, I sense continuous flux.
Yeah, yeah,
And
but I'm not. That doesn't seem like a metaphor to me. I think he's actually trying to give it a description. But you're right. I mean, uh, calling intuition the apprehension of flux, flowing, change, whatever. But I suppose even if he doesn't give a positive metaphor here, we've got Heraclitus who talks about not being able to step in the same river twice, but the river is both change because it's constantly flowing. Um, but there's also a sort of identity to the change, and I suppose that the fact of change or the constancy of change or whatever is a way of describing intuition positively. I mean, the thing that's tricky about it is that um, if you want, so first of all, Bergson thinks that concepts are never going to get you to intuition, right? Um, the most you can do is approach it asymptotically, like a curve that never quite reaches zero, but reaches some infinitesimal non-zero value, right? but in order to get the intuition, you actually have to reach 0 or 1 if you're on the y-axis, right? Um, and so concepts will never get you there. But then, of course, if you want to give a description, you're not going to be able to do it without concepts,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it does stand to reason that there is no way to conceptually describe it positively because you can't get there through concepts, right?
Yeah. It's not
Um,
the ball, the rolling of the ball,
that's
you
true.
know?
That's true. Yeah, he makes those, that's right. There are those metaphors, right? So, or he talks about a coil that is expanding. I think there are a few different motion metaphors. Maybe it's an arm like a motion, but the point is, okay, now think about that motion, but without the arm. But now think about that motion not in any spatial coordinates. And now you've got intuition,
Yeah.
something like that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and he doesn't really give what I would call a particularly rigorous methodology in this essay, but towards the end, he tries to enumerate, I think, 9 propositions
Oh, I
that
see.
they're not really stated in the imperative, as far as I remember, um, but they do attempt to describe what's involved in uh, the metaphysics of intuition or intuition as metaphysics, and also try to separate it from what it's not, conceptual analysis and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, it's unfortunate that you guys only read half of it because there's some really interesting stuff at the end, but I guess we'll start with what you guys have. Sandesh should know, but Justin, just to be clear, I usually like you guys to summarize as succinctly as is warranted, not as succinctly as possible, but as one thing about Bergson in this writing is the writing is autological, which basically just means it's an example of what he's trying to describe. Why do I say that? This should be
It's an
clear from at
example.
least this should be clear even in just the first half of it. Sorry, go ahead, Sanders.
So what is it? It's an example of what he's trying to describe.
Yeah. So like for instance, if I try to describe the blue cup on my desk, I might say, well, it's conical. Um, the open end is wider than the narrower end, and it's blue, and it has a handle, la 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 la. Is that description an example of the thing that I'm describing? A cup? Is my description a cup? No.
Yeah, yeah,
Using words to describe an object.
Well, that's true. That's true. Um,
But
okay.
that's kind of my question about this is, isn't using articulating using words already getting away from the process of intuition?
Yeah, that is one thing to say. So I suppose there are 2 things that he describes in this. One, what intuition is, and 2, what it's not. And it's only autological to the extent that he describes what intuition is not. But what does he say about the way that we try to get to intuition through concepts? I've already said it a few times, but he gives lots of examples.
Basically, that you will never be able to, like, you can only get closer and closer to it. But he also says that you can, like, start to multiply out, like, the more that you bring in other concepts, the more that they relate to each other
Mhm.
rather than to
Yeah,
intuition. So you can actually start to get further away from the thing you're going for.
that's true. And maybe his essay is guilty of that. Right. The point is, what he says is, look, what science does, what discursive analysis does in trying to get to that core of intuition is simply try to persuade by accumulation.
Mhm.
Accumulation of concepts, accumulation of descriptions, but the descriptions are at best metaphorical, because concepts aren't intuition. And to the extent that you can kind of sketch out a picture of it, it's going to be like this very schematic, sort of like if you've ever seen what the world looks like to a fly with compound eyes, where it's like a mosaic. Everything looks like a mosaic. Um, that's what concepts enable. That's the sort of view that concepts enable of intuition, right? Now, how is he bringing that awareness to us? By simply accumulating lots and lots of descriptions and metaphors, and there is a sense that there's something kind of repetitive in a way, right? And he sort of demonstrates the futility of talking about intuition through that repetitive aspect of the text. It's like, constantly trying to say the same thing from a slightly different point of view or from a slightly different metaphor. And I'm sure that if you've, for instance, had a situation where this is something you would probably experience more likely in like a music appreciation class, but maybe in theory or musicianship, you've had this kind of thing where you're trying to explain like how, so maybe you have a student who's really bad at ear training and they ask you, how can I tell the difference between a major and a minor third? I just can't hear it. What you're going to do is something very similar to what Bergson's doing here, right? Which is you try to maybe give them metaphors or try to explain it in a bunch of different ways, but you never quite get to the core of how do I know if it's a minor or a major third? You just know. You train yourself so that you recognize it, perhaps. Maybe there's some conceptual analysis in that, but even so, you still have to put content into the comparison, right? That is, it's not that it's a strictly formal comparison that, 4 is a larger number than 3 or something like that. There's content in this. There's intuitive or perceptual phenomenal content in the comparison. That sound is different from that sound.
Yeah.
Right. And so if they really can't, process the sound that way, the best you can do is just kind of hint at it through an accumulation of descriptions. And to the extent that an accumulation of descriptions is successful, Bergson talks about this a lot. How could an accumulation of descriptions or metaphors successfully put someone in mind of intuition? How does it work? When it does work, how does it work?
I'm looking at I highlighted this one passage where he says the single aim of the philosopher should be to promote a certain effort, which in most men is usually fettered by habits of mind more useful to life. So he's kind of pointing you and then saying, but you have to do this internal certain, and here's how to do it.
Right. Well, what are the habits of mind here?
Conditioning and experience, well, mostly experience, like the accumulation of past mental states or past events.
Yeah, I think there's something even more specific that he has in mind. How do we normally think when, for instance, someone asks you for an explanation?
Through memory?
What?
Memory?
Say it again, I can't hear you.
Memory.
Well, let's bracket memory for a moment, just because memory has this very specific meaning and role in what Bergson has to say about the intuition of time. So let's not worry about memory, but the answer is not memory. That's not what he's getting at here. The habit of mind is substance thinking. Thinking that if you want to give an account or an explanation of anything, you first have to start with, well, what are the basic things we're talking about?
Yeah, what is it?
What is it? Right. So, it's like Aristotle's law of identity. If you want to say anything, you first have to posit that there's something you're talking about. Right. But that's not necessarily true if we think that you know, process is ontologically prior to substance, right? Um, here's another way to say it, by way of Descartes. The cogito. Yeah, okay, Justin, since you're nodding vigorously, explain the cogito to me.
It's just the famous "I think, therefore I am."
Yeah, but what does that mean? Why should
Oh,
we?
it's a way of knowing that the self exists because of the ability to think.
Okay, but that's not the proof.
Oh, I will. I don't know then.
So the reason, so it's a proof by the logical form is reductio ad absurdum. In other words, the opposite position is a contradiction. Where's the contradiction if I say that maybe nothing exists?
Because you must exist if you're thinking.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so skepticism is, at the very least, a form of thought. You can't be skeptical without thinking. So if you think, then something must exist. And um, actually, Descartes, that's probably true, but Descartes makes two inferences that don't actually follow. One, that something exists, and that something is myself,
Hmm.
right? Because um, just because thinking doesn't mean things. After all, thinking is, it's got the gerund. It's not, thought. It's thinking. So it could just be thinking is happening, or even just saying thinking is already a verb. It's not a noun, right? So why is he justified in thinking that there's a thinking thing, the res cogitans, the thinking thing? He just asserts that dogmatically.
Mhm.
Why is it a thing? Maybe it's thinking as process, right? That's a similar sort of problem with Aristotle. They just dogmatically assert that you have to think in terms of things, otherwise you don't have thought, right? Well, that's not true. Why should we accept that, right? That's the habit of mind that Bergson's talking about here, right? Getting out of that, noun-based way of thinking that asserts that, I would say, by the way, in an account of social theory, say the accounts of Hobbes or Locke or a number of liberal thinkers, the idea that if you want to analyze society from the ground up, you break it down to its most fundamental atomic unit, the individual. In other words, that's, the social substance is the individual. And then you can build society out of analyzing different relationships between individuals or something like that. But what's fundamental is the individual. But we don't necessarily need to accept that, because from Hegel on, there's this idea that, well, individuality has no meaning outside of relationships. In other words, whenever you posit anything, uh, something that's entailed in the positive formulation of A is also not A, because in order to know what A is, you have to know what A is not. You need to know what the limits of A are, right? So any substance or anything that you posit, you can only posit at all. Logically entailed in that positing is its relationship to its complement, its relationship to its contradictories and contraries, and so on. The way that we would say it in kind of disgusting neoliberal university admin speak is we before me, or something like that. But the basic idea is that, before you have any concepts at all, you're already in relation to the world, to other people, right? And so, that's another sort of habit of mind that Bergson would want us to break out of, this idea that um, we're essentially individual solipsists that, you know, um, think in terms of things and so on. Yeah. So, but um, as to the question of what is the habit that we first need to break out of, but even breaking out of that habit, it doesn't follow directly that we would know how to successfully refer to intuition or bring about an awareness or I guess an understanding of intuition in the person we're talking to. There's exactly one way that that works, and it's not really because of something we're doing. So how is, to the extent that talking about intuition works, to the extent that using descriptions, concepts, metaphors works, how does it work? How does it actually hook someone up with, oh yeah, intuition? And again, the hint is that it's not something you're doing in your description.
Yeah, because you need to get into the internal state of the object, right? And we were talking about sympathy the last time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's actually a much simpler answer than that, but we can move there to the sympathy part of it in a moment. But okay. You know how like last week I described that cardboard box, it was a kind bar box, and I described it. And until you actually saw it, you probably didn't really know what it looked like, even though I gave you a pretty full description of it. I mean, as soon as you see it, then all those descriptions kind of, yeah, they make sense, but without having seen it, it's just some sort of abstract thing, right? That's an example of what Bergson's talking about, but there's a sort of, what's the general rule or what's the general condition under which a person can be whatever, I guess, reminded of their intuition or something? What's the necessary? So it really is a necessary condition. If you want to, let's just say remind means put someone in mind of intuition or something like that through concepts. To remind is to use concepts in such a way that people know what you're talking about with respect to intuition. What is really the necessary condition, the main necessary condition for that? How is it possible?
can I say memory now or no?
Maybe it might have something to do with memory. Yeah.
You use the word remind, and
Yeah. But try to look, the answer I'm looking for can be said in like 3 or 4 words.
okay.
So it's the sort of thing that actually has some pretty significant consequences, but it's not difficult to get to. The idea is not difficult to get to.
Well, that we're
Yeah, go
both
ahead. Sorry.
subjects in, well, that
Yeah,
we're
go
both subjects, and we experience the world, and
Mhm.
because the question is like, what are the necessary conditions for one subject to tell the other subject about their own intuition, right? That you can intuit, and
Mhm.
that's what.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the question, but what's the
Yeah,
answer?
yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll try to give you another example. Let's see. I mean, actually, Bergson gives a few examples, but I can't think of what they are off the top of my head. He talks about Paris and seeing the Eiffel Tower, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, maybe I should choose a less well-known location. Maybe you guys have been to Paris, I don't know. But have you guys been to Chicago? Yeah.
Only brief.
I'm trying to think of a place that is well known. And I mean, okay, have you been to the house that I grew up in?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. Now, what I want to do is put you in a direct, sort of experiential relationship with that, of the sort that I have, right? I can't do it. But there are people for whom I could do it. For instance, my mom, my sister, you know. Well, why does it work for them but not for you?
Because they have a better knowledge
In what
of
sense?
um that well, did you say your mom?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So
So
you know,
if I started saying, "Oh, you remember how one of the walls had like a little alcove cut out of it, and that was right around the corner from where like the master bedroom was, and we had a kind of funky old garage and stuff." Um, my mom would know exactly what I'm talking about, and she'd be
yeah,
able to picture it in her mind. Why can she do that, but you can't?
is I mean, simple way of putting it is she's seen it in
Yeah, exactly right. Here's the thing. Concepts can put you in mind of your intuition, but only because you have intuition, right? You got to have it first, right? And that's the whole thing. So, like, look, I give you thousands and thousands of descriptions of Paris, and I even like draw, like, you know, sketch of the Eiffel Tower and whatever. None of that actually connects you to the intuitive understanding or the intuitive awareness or apprehension of Paris. It's only possible to the extent that you've already experienced Paris, and now all of that fits perfectly. But it fits perfectly because you're filling in from your own intuitive awareness what the concepts leave out, the details, the uniqueness, right? And so it's this idea that you know, concepts, we often mistake concepts for an actual account of reality, but concepts only can describe or explain or account for reality if we already have this intuitive relation relation to it. Um, in which case, then we're really just using concepts to kind of remind us of what we already know,
Mhm.
right? Through intuition. And it's an interesting sort of bootstrapping problem, right? I mean, it's sort of like, well, if I want to describe, let's say I have a physical theory, a physics theory, right? And I want to describe, say, whatever, uh, um, causality at a distance or some weird thing or whatever, or even, maybe like black holes or something. Uh, it's sort of a strange sort of thing. Like, what do I know? How do I know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I mean, like we think that we know what black holes are, even though nobody's really seen one. At best, we've seen like a very fuzzy image of one that is already going to be stylized through the equipment that we use, and you know it's not like really experiencing the black hole. So how do we know in our physical theories when we're trying to explain or account for something we've never experienced? How do we know what we're talking about? And this is very similar to a problem that Plato identified in the dialogue, the Meno. It's a little bit different, but both Plato and Bergson have this idea of knowledge as recollection, knowledge as memory of a sort. The way it works in the Meno is basically this. Socrates is at this guy's house. His name is Meno, and Meno has a bunch of like slave boys or something that haven't ever been educated, right? And what Socrates does is he draws a 4x4 square in the sand and says, "Hey, slave boy, if I want to double the area of this square, how do I do it?" And then the slave boy says, "Well, it's 2x2, so then we should make it 4x4. That would be double." And then they do it, and then they realize, "Oh crap, now we've quadrupled." Or is that right? Yeah, we've quadrupled the area. Instead of the area being 4, now it's 16. And so then what Socrates does is, well, how would we figure this out? And then he draws like the diagonal. So he draws like a diamond within the square. And, but he's constantly asking, he's never telling the boy. what to do. He just says, well, is there a way that we could divide this? And then the boy says, yeah, you could divide it diagonally like that. And then, right. And so at the end, this, uneducated person nonetheless knows the laws of geometry. Well, how's that possible unless the boy already knew the laws of geometry, right? It's like when you learn mathematics, right? It's like, how is it possible unless you sort of already implicitly know what mathematics is, right? After all, mathematics doesn't rely on demonstration. It doesn't rely on observation. It just relies on me showing you what must follow given things you already know. And how do you know that it follows? You just know because it makes sense or whatever, right? And so the problem that arises from that is, look, if you already know something, then it seems odd that you would have to look for it, that you'd have to search for it or reason about it. But if you don't know, then how would you even know what to look for? Right. And that's often called the Meno problem. There are a bunch of different solutions to that or attempts to resolve it. But there's the same kind of problem here with intuition, right? Except instead of it being so, Plato thinks that what we're remembering are abstract definitions, essentially, like Platonic forms, right? Geometrical definitions and whatever. What Bergson thinks we have to remember is the direct, immediate, intuitive awareness of reality. But if you don't have that, there's no way that concepts are going to put you in mind of it. You already have to have it. Yeah.
You do need the concepts in order to get maybe closer to it, right? Because like you're saying, like if you can't name something, like how would you know what it is, right? So I feel like
You
there's
can't name something okay, are you talking about Plato or are you talking about Bergson?
well, yeah, going from the Plato example, what did you say? You said if you don't know what you're talking about, then you wouldn't talk about it or something like that.
Yeah, well, okay. If you don't know what something is, okay, let's say that I say to you, let's say I'm some like mafia boss or something, and I say, hey, yous guys, I need you to go pick up an item. And you're like, sure, boss. What's the item, boss? It's like, you have to remember. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, boss. And then whatever, you go to the warehouse, it's like, well, what are we looking for? Right? Okay. But let's say now both Bergson and Plato think that in their respective cases, the kind of knowledge you have to remember is absolute knowledge. And that's important. Now, if you have absolute knowledge, even though you don't remember it right now, I mean, if you have absolute knowledge, then why do you have to look for it? Part of the absoluteness of the knowledge would be what it is, where it is, right? So it's odd that you could even forget absolute knowledge, right? If you can forget it, then it seems, at least with respect to your access to it, it's not absolute, right? Yeah. Another way of saying it is like, well, let's see. What's something that's evident, very evident to you in your intuition right now? Something that's on your desk. Your computers. Your computers. I know your computers are on your desks. That's one of those seeing your own eyeballs moments where I forgot that we're looking through computers. But okay, I want you guys to look for your computers. That's a really weird request, isn't it? It's like, can you guys find your computers? It's like, I'm not even sure how to respond to that. It's like, I'm not looking for it because I have absolute intuitive knowledge of it. Right? That's the sort of problem, right? It's like first of all, if absolute knowledge, either in the Platonic or the Bergsonian sense, is possible, how could you ever lose it? Right?
He kind of saying, maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but is he kind of saying that there's this absolute knowledge is that which is only possible, in the present moment, and that the accumulation of the memories of the past experiences maybe obscures that knowledge. That it's not like we have to find it because we don't know where it is, but it's just that we're dealing with other things that don't constitute absolute knowledge.
Yeah, it's possible we could be distracted. And I suppose both in Plato and in Bergson, the spatial metaphor is just a metaphor. It's not really spatial, either in Plato or Bergson. Maybe I could put the point this way a little bit more clearly. Let's talk about AI. You want AI to not just be following syntactical rules. You want your AI to have general intelligence, which also includes intuitive intelligence.
Mhm.
But how do you program that into a computer if, conceptual rules aren't enough to ever get you to the limit? As I said, the conceptual rules on Bergson's account anyway, at best asymptotically approach it, but never actually get you there, right? So for the computer to actually have that sort of general intelligence, you couldn't do it through formal rules, right? The computer, at best, the formal rules could remind the computer or the AI of what it already has.
Mhm.
But how can you get to the intuitive knowledge or the intuitive um, ability or power through the rules? Bergson is saying you can't. But then you have a sort of problem. It's like maybe AI can never achieve general intelligence, at least. I mean, this has been known for about 80 years or so, that the uh, formal approach to AI, that is to say, the syntactical rule-based approach to AI, is ultimately going to fail. This is something that, I guess like John Searle pointed out, and a number of other people pointed out, not just Searle. Actually, and even Searle didn't exactly point it out in that context, but that's one of the things that motivated the change from formal AI to uh, large language model AI, where it's no longer about following an exhaustive set of rules to achieve something like consciousness. It's simply you have a very simple rule. What is it called? Um, Stochastic gradient descent is what it's called. Basically, it's just like you give the computer some stimulus, and it sort of at the very initial level, it just sort of randomly classifies things, and then you have a human that says, oh, that was classified correctly, that was classified incorrectly, right? And you do that a billion or 10 billion or 10 trillion times on a huge data set, and eventually you have like just a kind of statistical model of what regularities occur in a huge amount of data, right? That was a shift where it's like a very simple rule and lots of data versus pretty much no outside data, but simply complex systems of rules, right? And so, in the current version of AI, they're kind of trying to teach computers to have intuition just by a sheer onslaught, inundation of billions and billions of data points. Um, I I guess Bergson would probably, well, I don't know, maybe I'll ask you, what do you think Bergson would say about that approach, the sort of chat GPT approach to intuition? Do you think he would think that it's viable, or do you think he would think that it's ultimately going to fail?
I think it's the asymptotic problem again, right? Like, well, how many billions of data points do you need until you get to intuition?
Yeah. Now, this isn't a knockdown argument, it's just a sort of instructive point to make. But one thing that differentiates human intuition from the sort of intuition that an AI might have on the large, data model is that we're able to apprehend intuitively without, when we're infants being subjected to billions and billions and billions of data points, right? Here's one maybe more persuasive description of that. How did ChatGPT learn its languages? By reading through, like the entire history of human written language, right? At least everything that's available online, right? How does a human infant learn language? By hearing their parents and a couple other people speak, a few hours a day or something, right? So it seems evident that the way that we at least learn language is really, really different and does not require that amount of input that you get in, say, ChatGPT. So at least at that level, human intelligence and AI intelligence are quite different. I think that the same point could basically be made about intuition and, like object recognition and that kind of thing, right? I mean, we more or less come right out of the womb with the ability to recognize objects and to distinguish and that sort of thing, or at the very least, like we know how to do it in a couple months. It took 40 years to get to the point where, AIs are able to do this. And even so, the ones that are most current now, they have access to like nearly the entire human history of visual material, on the internet, right? Like unfathomably larger orders of magnitude more data than your average human infant has, right? So it does seem that even though it doesn't rule out the possibility that you could still get to intuition through large data sets, it certainly seems to support the idea that whatever kind of intuition that would be, it would be arrived at in a much different way from human intuition, right? My guess is that just knowing what Bergson had to say about the way that concepts are actually just expressions of essentially biological interests, that he would probably be in the biology camp of AI, that consciousness arises out of organic interactions, organisms and their environment, and that consciousness is a fairly sophisticated kind of coping or survival mechanism, right? But it requires a basis in an environment, really in an organic environment, for it to really have this power of intuition, as opposed to either the rule-based AI or the large data set version of AI. It's got to somehow already be doing these things without or maybe I should say it this way. It's not really about doing these things without being conscious, because that's already the case. It is doing things without really being conscious of what it's doing. Here's the difference with organisms. Their activity is purposive. In other words, actually, Sean Carroll, he's a podcaster who he has a pretty cool podcast. I don't know if you've ever listened to it. It's quite good.
Physics guy?
Well, yeah, the physics guy. But he put the point this way. Compare pretty much any organism, certainly a human being, a language user, a organic language user, compare that to ChatGPT. One thing ChatGPT doesn't do is, if you just turn ChatGPT on and don't do anything with it, don't type anything, it's not like ChatGPT is then going to start saying, hey, is anybody there? Or that ChatGPT's mind is going to wander and start doing spontaneous things from its own underlying, interests and motivations, the way that a human would. Like if I just sit you down and say, okay, and we just sit there, you would at the very least want to know why I asked you there, And the point is not that, I mean, it would be very easy to program into ChatGPT, wait 2 minutes, and after 2 minutes, give the user a prompt. But that's not what's going on in human intelligence. That human intelligence is purposive in the sense that all of our activity is motivated, motivated by our interests, our biological interests, and that consciousness is a further expression of our ability to act on those interests. Our ability, but also there's a sort of maybe you know, deterministic element to this as well, right? We don't necessarily choose what our interests are. But the point is that there's always something motivational in everything we do, which is not the case with ChatGPT, which is just, you know, it's just following a program, basically. I mean, it's basically, you know, you type in some text and it applies a statistical analysis to the letters, you know, that you've put there. And it's very sophisticated statistical analysis that works on multiple hierarchies and whatnot. But nonetheless, it's not motivational in the same sense. It's simply a formal rule that's being followed. And so the idea is that consciousness must arise out of the fact that even organisms that on a, I suppose, on a formal level or on a rule governed level are even much simpler than ChatGPT, organisms like amoebas, nonetheless engage in purposive activity.
Yeah.
Right. And that probably has something to do with chemical interactions. Who knows? I mean, the state of the biology of consciousness is, you know, nowhere near giving a good account of how you get consciousness at all, either through, you know, formal means or biological means or whatever. But the idea is that there's this sort of organic substrate that has certain regularities, that has certain things that, you know, at a certain point we would call interests or motivations or whatever. And that intuition, consciousness, understanding is an expression of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't think I ever thought about ChatGPT, ChatGPT's interests. And yeah, and like Bergson talks about like how you know we were talking about this last week about how we navigate around the world because we're due to our interests. And even when I look at like this cup right here, I'm choosing what to exclude and subtract
Mm-hmm.
and what factors interest me, right? And
Yeah, and just to be really clear about it, I mean, the interest is just you want to enjoy a nice warm beverage on this cold morning. That's
yeah,
what it's a cup to you,
yeah, yeah,
right? Whereas if your interest were to build a really cool and funky musical instrument, it wouldn't be a cup anymore. It would be something else, right? Um, yeah, just to kind of give a silly but maybe
yeah.
hopefully clear example. Yeah. So, you know, I think that now one thing that's sort of interesting, I suppose, is that Bergson certainly makes the case that concepts and the way we divide the world into concepts is going to be based on our perspective, which is to say our interests. But he seems to make the case that intuition is not, that intuition is absolute, is non-perspectival. And I guess I sort of wonder if that idea really makes sense, right? Like, you know, a moment ago I was giving the example of ChatGPT not having that sort of intuition, presumably because it doesn't have interest, because it's not biological, right? But Bergson seems to think that interest or that intuition is somehow special or somehow different from concepts as regards interest.
Mhm.
What do you guys think? Do you think that that is a tenable point, or do you think that it has problems? Is intuition absolute in the sense of, maybe it's absolute in the sense of non-perspectival. I'm not sure that it's absolute in the sense of disinterested, but tell me what you guys think.
For me, it would almost be the opposite, right? Wouldn't like if intuition, if we are just talking about intuition as the thing that separates us from, you know, computer,
Mhm.
um, wouldn't that be exactly that? Like it's our own perspective that maybe can't be put into concepts because we've dealt with it just directly through experience.
Maybe. I mean, it does seem to me that if what you're trying to do is distinguish yourself from your computer, that's conceptual, not intuitive. Because on Bergson's account, you should be able to intellectually sympathize with your computer. Right. So that part of it, yeah, I don't think that that's really a good argument against the idea that intuition is disinterested, right? Well, if it is disinterested, it's not because, or if it's interested or disinterested, it's not because we can distinguish ourselves from our computer, because anyway, that's conceptual and not intuitive, right? So here's what you could do if you don't have an opinion. You could nonetheless try to make the case both for and against. So to resolve, is intuition interested or disinterested? Give me the for argument that it is disinterested. And I'm not sure that he's really claiming that it's disinterested, but it does say it's absolute. So it's hard for me to I mean, he spends a lot of time talking about how concepts can never be absolute because they're always essentially interested. And even if you try to have disinterested contemplation, it's either a paradox or it's sophistry. This might be after what you guys read, but he does think, as regards concepts, the idea of disinterestedness is not worthwhile. You should just throw it away because it's either a contradiction or it leads to something other than what we might call the absolute. But he doesn't seem to think that about intuition because he calls it absolute. It's non-perspectival. It's not relative. So it's hard for me to see how then it would not be disinterested if it's not relative and it is absolute. I think I already made the case against Bergson that intuition probably is interested, but why don't you just summarize what I said or maybe add your own points? First, make that case that intuition is ultimately interested. Yeah, by the way, Justin, it's clear what I mean when I say interested and disinterested, right?
Well, what's the difference between interested and perspectival?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that interest has the further aspect of motivation, whereas perspectival might be unmotivated. It's just you have this perspective, but it's not because you're trying to achieve a purpose or anything. Whereas interest is trying to achieve a purpose. Right. So, Bergson doesn't really, he does, I can follow Bergson on the idea that intuition is maybe non-perspectival. In that sense, that it's not motivated, or well, rather that, well, let's not worry about that now. The question is, and I'm not sure that Bergson really gives us an argument one way or the other, but it is significant to know, is intuition interested in the way that concepts are interested or any of the other sort of, analytical, explanatory thinking, substance thinking is interested? So just to sum up, Justin, since Sandesh already kind of described it, what's the case for saying that conceptual thinking is ultimately interested? Okay, I'll try to start you off. What do you have on your head?
A hat.
Why is it a hat to you?
Oh, yes. Well, because the things that the way we interact with things depends on our motivation or
The
our
way we
purpose.
conceptualize things.
Visualize things depends on our motivation or purpose for using
Yeah,
them, like
exactly.
the analogy about the instrument or
Yeah,
um,
exactly. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So that's the case that concepts are ultimately interested. And it's significant because if you think that concepts classically are something like Platonic ideals, right? So that, the concept of table is just like the essential table. It's not spatial or temporal. It's not from a particular perspective. It's just like, there are necessary and sufficient conditions for a thing to be a table. And that's just the way it is. It's not about wanting it to be a table or something like that. It's just, table is a stupid example. I should use an example like the concept of justice, right? Justice is not about what you want out of the world. If what you want just is, your material interests to be satisfied, or you want, power. So Alcibiades in the Republic, when Socrates asks, what is justice? He says, justice is just the advantage of the stronger. In other words, it's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules, right? Or, it's might makes right, or this kind of thing. And justice is just the assertion of power over the weak.
Mm.
Okay, so that's one thinking about what justice is. And Socrates ultimately says, well, that's not really justice, because I can give you all sorts of examples where we follow that rule, and you would say that that's not just. Part of the idea here is that justice is not ultimately about my interest or your interest or, somebody else's interest. Justice, for it to be truly just, justice as such has to be disinterested. It has to be something that is over and above the interests that I argue with you about and that you argue with Sandish about and whatnot. It's got to be something that somehow unites unites all of our interests. And the idea is that it does so because there's a sort of lack of interest. This is a point that Bergson makes. He says that at best, what you get in the idea of a disinterested concept is just like a panoptic view of a bunch of interests. But that's not the same thing as having no interest. Another way to say it, like conceptual disinterestedness, is have you ever heard the phrase like the view from nowhere or the God's eye view of reality? What does that mean? The view from nowhere.
Like removing yourself from the situation.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you want to understand all of reality, there's this idea that you have to be able to see all of reality. And there's this interesting inherent, probably contradiction in this, that if you want to see all of reality and you yourself are in reality, then you can't see all of reality because there's got to be some space from which you're seeing that you yourself don't see, right? Or maybe somehow you're just totally outside of reality, right? In which case, maybe you're in some weird platonic realm of ideals that has no space or time. I don't know. Maybe that's one way to see the whole world, but um, the idea is that if you want to get to a complete understanding of anything, that you have to do it in a way that is not perspectival. And one perspective is your motivations, right? So the idea is that logic is supposed to be disinterested. Concepts in the Platonic sense are supposed to be disinterested. Justice isn't about, you know, just having the ability to oppress people, even if though that's possible. I could have a peaceful society in which I'm just a really oppressive guy and nobody has enough power to challenge me or something. And it's peaceful in the sense of there not being a lot of crime or war because I'm a total dictator or tyrant or something. But most people would think, yeah, but that's not justice because it's only you pursuing your interest. Right? Okay, so that's kind of the traditional view of concepts as disinterested. And then what Bergson is saying is no, concepts are interested.
Yeah.
And they're interested for the reason that we've been talking about, where it's like, well, you only have the concept, you only divide the world up into these concepts based on what you're trying to do in the world. In other words, your interests. Now, the question is intuition interested in just the same way? Or is it absolute and disinterested?
Yeah, I think I'm leaning more towards it being disinterested.
Okay.
And
even if you don't have a total argument put together, just start talking and
Yeah.
what we can do with it.
So yeah, if intuition is just something where it is outside of concepts, and like rational thinking or whatever, and it's just something that you're sort of born with, and it sort of predates, maybe even predates your own existence or something like that. um,
Maybe. I guess
um,
I want to hear a little bit more about how intuition can predate my existence.
I'm kind of thinking about trying to compare it with like maybe absolute space, where if you didn't exist, this absoluteness of space would still be there. Um, and maybe thinking of intuition as some sort of a collective sort of thinking, not
Yeah,
thinking.
what I would say to tie it closer to what Bergson himself says is that, he's talking about intuition as intellectual sympathy.
Mm-hmm,
To the extent that it's sympathy, it's this idea that it connects you to everything.
mm-hmm,
Well, the everything probably predates me, or at least is logically prior to me, right? Um, and so it does seem that the thing that intellectual sympathy connects me to, um, maybe that's different from the act of connecting to that, but it does seem that if I'm intuiting from my own experience of my selfhood or my consciousness, this sort of pure duration kind of thing, um, well, pure duration is something that predates me.
yeah.
And I have access to pure duration through intuition, right? That's like, it's kind of like, let's see if I can get a spatial metaphor going here. It's um, because intuition is the access way into pure duration.
Mm-hmm,
And it's sort of like, you know, a door is an access way, but it's certainly logically prior to the access way is the idea of a destination or something like that, right?
mm-hmm,
So you could say that in that sense, it's at least logically prior. If intuition is just the access way to connecting with everything, then yeah, I mean, intuition is a doorway, but entailed in the idea of the doorway is the destination, the everything, right?
mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe something like that. But can you continue to develop the idea of why intuition is disinterested? I see where you're going, maybe that it does have this, if it does connect you to everything, then that seems to suggest that it's at least non-perspectival. But I really want to bring up a distinction between perspectival and interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I would say is that if you're giving what amounts to a conceptual analysis of intuition,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, that's probably not what Bergson would say is really the right way to get in touch with intuition. You have to you get in touch with intuition by doing intuition,
Mm-hmm.
but and not by describing what the necessary and sufficient conditions are, right? Like for instance, that everything predates you or is logically prior to you or something like that. But when we talk about interest, it doesn't seem like he's giving us a logical analysis or a conceptual analysis. He's giving us a genetic analysis. He's not asking what is logically entailed in the idea of concept or of interest. He's asking, how did we get to concepts? How is it that this species, Homo sapiens, which is a historical species, at some point started talking about concepts, started applying concepts, started thinking about the world in terms of identities. And so there, the biological uh, account is really a historical account or a genetic account, right? It's not saying what is logically entailed in the idea of interest, but rather how did interests come about in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then I think you could do the same thing with intuition. It's not about logically analyzing or conceptually analyzing intuition in terms of, necessary and sufficient conditions. It's about asking, how is it that intuition arose in the first place? Right. And there, it doesn't seem to me that you could make the very same case for interest that you could make about concepts. Right. That we have intuition because it's evolutionarily advantageous, essentially, right?
Mhm.
In which case it would be interested too.
Isn't that kind of like what you were saying about how, an infant, a baby that's born automatically recognizes objects, can pick up
Mm.
language without, many millions of words, that there would be some interest in that, like
Mhm.
we've evolved to be able to do these things
Mhm.
to survive.
Yeah, I think that would probably be an expression of that. One thing I would say though, of course, is that given what you haven't gotten to the Kant part of the essay, but he doesn't like Kant for a bunch of reasons. And given what he says about Kant and Kant's moral theory and all this kind of stuff, it's not at all clear to me that Bergson thinks that interest is bad in the way that Kant does. I think that Bergson actually would be much closer to Nietzsche in saying that interest is just a way of describing value, right? Our interests are what we take to be good, or the opposite of what we take to be bad. We're disinclined to pursue the things we think are bad, right? And that just means we're engaged in purposive activity. We value certain things, we want to get them, we want to avoid other things. And so I think that if you do say that intuition is ultimately an expression of interest, I don't think that Bergson would say that's a bad thing. I think what he would say is that that's fine. It's just that maybe value, if we understand intuition as getting us in touch with fundamental reality, pure duration or whatever, um, and if intuition is ultimately interested, at least on a genetic account, that's just to say that we take intuition to be good. We take connecting to pure duration to be good. So it is interested. It's just that interest isn't a bad thing.
Mhm.
Um, I guess maybe that would help to clarify what he says about the contradiction of disinterest in philosophy, right? Um, maybe you guys didn't get to this part of the essay, but one of the things he says, I already mentioned this once, but there are a lot of most philosophers, most people like Plato, Kant, a number of the most influential sort of what Deleuze is kind of called the major lineage in philosophy versus the minor lineage, take disinterestedness to be good. They think interest bad, disinterest good, right? Because logic is supposed to be disinterested, right? And then what Bergson says is that, well, okay, but if interest is just value, in other words, if your interests are just what you value, your desire to pursue a certain end, and then if what you value is not valuing, if your interest is disinterestedness, that just seems like a contradiction.
Mhm.
Or the other thing it could mean is if it's not a contradiction, then it means that all this talk about disinterest is actually relative. Everybody claims to be disinterested, but everybody also has a different account and a different opinion on what is true. And so, really, what philosophy devolves to is just a sort of war of different schools of philosophy, which is to say, philosophy is just sophistry.
Mhm.
It's not in the pursuit of a disinterested truth, it's in pursuit of winning the philosophy game,
Mhm.
right? So it's either contradictory or sophistry, the
Mhm.
very notion of disinterest. Because even doing philosophy is an interested activity. Why are you guys spending your time on, this beautiful morning to do this kind of stuff if you didn't value it in some way, right? Um, And so I think that he's probably, yeah, I think that he's splitting apart the idea of perspectival thinking from interested thinking, that maybe intuition could be non-perspectival, but it is interested, but it's just because interest is good. And now it's not to say that interest is good in some absolute sense, like it's intrinsically good. It's just to have an interest is to value something. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's good. That wasn't clear to me until we had this conversation. So I'm glad we had the conversation. But
Yeah. I mean, the word intuition has come up, at least for me, in the past, just in like composition lessons or
mhm,
kind of like my, I don't know, earlier guitar teachers and stuff. Like, just use your intuition, or like, how did you do this? And I would say, oh, I just use my intuition. And
mhm,
I feel like a lot of the times it's just confused with whatever is easy,
mhm,
easily accessible for me in the moment.
mhm,
Uh, but I think it's a lot more I don't know, deeper
mhm,
than that.
mhm. Yeah. You guys, yeah, there's so many good things. There are a couple things that I want to talk about, but I don't know like how far into the essay you got. What was the last thing you guys read?
Uh, Last thing I read was this is page number 43.
Yeah. But what's
Um,
the
oh, basically,
I'm just looking at my notes, so just tell me like what he was talking about.
oh, so he's just saying like, well, maybe there is no philosophy that's possible, and all of knowledge is just like practical knowledge, aimed
Mm-hmm.
to cause some sort of profit. Is like what we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
And but he's saying in order to understand the nature of intuition, we need to get back, we need to fix some sort of precision where analysis ends, and uh, he says like, let's go back to talking about duration.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and
Did you guys get to the section on psychology? He's talking about
yes,
empirical psychology and rational psychology. And then he says both empiricism and rationalism essentially make the same error.
yeah, where they try to break down a person's personality by um, attaching like all these concepts,
Mm-hmm.
but then they don't really get to the, I guess, like the root, because they're constantly breaking down the subject into different, I guess, parts.
Well, yeah, so there are two problems or two schools that he criticizes. Empirical psychology, which I guess he doesn't specifically say this, but I think it is psychology that essentially stems from David Hume's bundle theory of the self. I don't know if that's an idea that's familiar to you guys, but the bundle theory of the self. Actually, some people think that Hume in the early 18th century was like a fellow of the Collège de Paris, and apparently there were some like Jesuit priests that were teaching there that had earlier been in like maybe Japan or somewhere in East Asia and potentially brought back some Buddhist philosophy to France. And they think there's some speculation that David Hume's idea of the self is indebted to Buddhist conceptions of the self. But in any case, the bundle theory of the self is this. It's similar to a lot of the skeptical uh, arguments that Hume has, which is that um, if you want to know whether something exists, analyze your experience. So, like in the case with causes, right? I see billiard ball one move, I see billiard ball two move, but I never saw a third thing, the cause. It's the same kind of thing with the bundle theory of the self. Think about your own perceptions, your thoughts, everything going on in your mental activity. Um, where in your mental activity do you sense yourself? I mean, I'm having a thought, I'm talking to you, I'm seeing myself looking at my screen. We're having an interesting conversation. I feel slightly hungry, slightly tired. I could enumerate lots and lots more perceptions that I'm having, even perceptions of thoughts that I'm having, but I never see another additional thing myself that's somehow distinct from those thoughts, right? That's basically the bundle theory, that there is no self. All there is the activity, the mental activity, perhaps, that I'm engaged in. My awareness of what I'm doing bodily, in a bodily sense, in a mental sense, various perceptions, but there's no further substance or substrate that I can point to in my experience anyway that is in addition to all that, right? And so that's kind of the view of psychology of the self that Bergson is talking about. But notice that I guess I slightly made an error in the way that I was describing that. I made Hume sound a little bit too much like Nietzsche. What Hume says is, I have this thought and this perception and that perception. Okay, so I'm enumerating these things that take place in my experience. Now, just because there's no further thing in my experience that is not those thoughts, in other words, like a self or something like that, I conclude there is no self, right? Notice that's a little bit different from how I described it, which was more Nietzschean. I think I might have said something like, what I experience is my activity, my thoughts, my perceptions, and so on. But that's not what Hume is saying. Hume is saying, no, those are things, not activities. It's not that he's making the Nietzschean claim that you are what you do. He's making the claim you have this thought and this thought and this thought and this thought and this thought. And there's no further experience of a self that's not just those thoughts. Right?
Yeah.
And so Bergson thinks that's wrong. Bergson thinks there is a self. Um, and he thinks that the error in empirical psychology is that just by enumerating thoughts as things, you come to the conclusion that since there is no further thought self, that it doesn't exist, right? And then rationalism, he thinks, has a similar problem. It's kind of from the opposite side. Do you remember what the problem is with rationalism as regards the self? I'll give you a hint. It has a lot to do with the way that rationalism is not so much about experience, but rather concepts, and the idea that, even if you look at someone like, Leibniz or people like Malebranche or a bunch of rationalists, they actually think that perceptions are actually just concepts, right? That if you see, like, you put a stick in some water and it looks bent, and it's not that it's an optical illusion or something in some sort of perceptual sense, it's that you're misapplying a concept, or you misunderstand the concept stick and the concept water and the concept of the relationship between these sorts of things, right? So that all perception is essentially conceptual. That's a rationalist point of view. And then the question is, what does that have to do with the self? Because in certain rationalist accounts, certainly not Kant, so I'm not sure. Well, Kant wasn't really a rationalist anyway, but the rationalist account that he seems to be describing is actually, for me, most clearly an anachronistic reference. Adorno has the view of the self that Bergson describes here in the rationalism section. Do you remember what it is? It's a little bit more complicated than the empiricist one.
Is it I remember he gives like a metaphor of like a poem, I think, and where you have a poem that you've never seen before, and they're all deconstructed into just like the letters of a poem or something.
Oh, that part. That's towards the beginning of the
Oh,
or well, no, actually, no, you might be right. I have a kind of janky version of it that has different page numbers. So,
I think if you, oh, are you looking at the one that I shared last time?
no, I'm looking at my own because It's the same translation, but
If you search for poem, I think it'll.
poem. Okay. I guess for me it's around page 12.
Oh, there's one a little later, 30 something.
No, what I would do is look for the word shadow.
Oh, I see.
Or yeah, let me find shadow. Uh let's see. Well, okay, yes, yes. Yes, okay. If you look out, so it's in the area of philosophical empiricism and then rationalism. Or here's an even better word to look for. Look for the word dupe, D-U-P-E.
Uh-huh.
You
Yeah.
get, but rationalism is the dupe of the same illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the section where he talks about the problems with rationalist accounts of the self.
Hmm.
And the rationalist, unlike the empiricist, the rationalist wants to affirm a sort of continuity of the self, but there's a problem in the way it's done. And the reason that I think that this has a lot to do with how Adorno thinks, if you remember, in negative dialectics, Sandesh, we talked a lot about, well, we didn't spend that much time on negative dialectics, but nonetheless, we talked about this idea of the non-identical,
Mm-hmm.
idea that Adorno developed. So Adorno says that the role of truth is to give voice to suffering, right? And that what we often want to do to alleviate our suffering is develop a concept that is adequate to our experience of the world. So, like for instance, this is something that is characteristic of most social movements, right? Like, what's sort of the logical account of the fact that people want to start using the singular they as a pronoun? I mean, one way of getting to it is the idea that 50 years ago, there was no social concept of non-perverse trans or something like that. Or like, I mean, that wasn't a concept that was available, that you could be normally, well functioning social person with respect and, a nice career and all this stuff, and also be trans. If you were trans, you were outside the system, right? What work does the singular they do? It develops a concept for that identity that lets it fit in society, right? And so part of the suffering that Adorno is talking about is the fact that any given social situation, any given society has certain concepts that it deems good, certain concepts that it deems bad, and then it also has situations where people will have very specific experience that is not described by any available concept. And so one thing that people do to alleviate the suffering of not fitting in society, to not fit in society means I don't have a concept that adequately conforms to my experience. What I want to do is develop an identity that is communal, that people recognize. And so I need to form a concept. And that's really what the they is doing, right? It's a concept that enables a certain experience to have a place in a society, right? Now, that part of it's nice, according to Adorno, but what's the problem with that?
The
At
it
basic
used
approach. Yeah, sorry,
it,
go ahead.
it used to be non-identical, and now it's become identical because it's what maybe a person felt like that, that they were, that what they experience is completely outside of what, I don't know, most of the society is experiencing. And hey man, like you can't like put me in any categories or whatever, right? And then they and them became an abstraction, or
Mhm.
a concept, and
Mhm.
now they're in this
Yeah,
category.
the
um,
idea is that actual human experience is a lot more varied and vibrant than the version of it described by a concept.
Mhm.
right? And whenever you conceptualize your unique experience, essentially what you're doing is stripping away all of the uniqueness and the actuality of it, right? All the details, all the stuff that makes it actual experience as opposed to, a dictionary definition of experience or something like that. Now, maybe the more salient way to talk about how concepts, while at one stage being a form of liberation or a form of at least alleviating suffering by the fact that it enables you to fit into a society now, the very fact of fitting into a society is also oppressive, right?
Mhm.
The idea is that once you develop a concept, there's this idea that there are right and wrong ways to belong to the concept. Um, Maybe I won't give a full description or analysis that connects this idea, but I think the most salient form of this is I remember reading uh, um, a New York Times ethicist column, right? So it's like a advice column. And there is a person who has a non-binary, who uses non-binary pronouns, and they're complaining about how they have a coworker who uses non-binary pronouns and also uses, or maybe uses a binary pronoun and then also, um,
Mhm.
so it's like she, sia, but
Mhm.
sia just means she in Spanish. And this person got really annoyed and angry. It's like, should I chew this person out for like appropriating the use of pronouns? And everybody said, no, that would be terrible. But what's
Mhm.
the logic behind that? The logic is that now that I've asserted this conceptual identity that I express in terms of saying they or something like that, now I can apply that as a way to admonish people for doing it wrong,
Yeah.
right? And it's not only that I admonish people for doing it wrong, I'm also denying myself my own freedom to think
Mhm.
to think of my experience outside of that restricting concept,
Mhm.
right? So that what Adorno finally comes to is this idea that we need to have an idea of the self that's adequate to the self in all of its, manifest richness, right? And complexity, the complexity of experience. I'll just call it that for now. Um, and so what he wants to do is have a notion of the self that is affirmative, but what's being affirmed is the non-identical. I'm affirming the non-self, if we mean by self something that fits a concept, right?
Mhm.
So I affirm the non-identical. I affirm negation.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what Bergson says rationalists do here. That their
Mhm.
version of the self isn't positive. To the extent that it's positive, it's only an affirmation of negation,
Mhm.
an affirmation of nothing. But then he says an affirmation of nothing is a void. It's just an empty shadow. It's dead. And what he wants is a living self, a self that's expressed positively in terms of life, of creativity, of what Deleuze is later, I think, going to call difference in itself, right? This idea of, if you think about difference in itself, there are two ways to say it. Certainly, difference in itself or pure duration or something like that is no thing, but just because it's no thing doesn't mean it's nothing,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, and so that's the claim that he's making that yeah, maybe rationalism gets a little bit further down the path because they want to affirm, you know, the self, the consciousness, the personality or whatever, but they do it in a way that ultimately kills it
Yeah.
because they're affirming negation. And so what he wants to do is say, well, but there's another way to describe it in terms of intuition, in terms of difference, pure duration, which is no thing, but is not nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if the example of the trans if it's interesting because like something that's like very subjective, like the experience of someone, the way they feel, and then they get into like a concept like a category like they, them, and then they treat it objectively. And I guess that's the problem when this person was maybe disagreeing with the Shisia person because they treat these abstractions as objective
The
facts.
the person who is displeased about it treats them as abstract.
Is treating the abstract concept of they, them as something very objective. It's
Mhm.
for them, even the subjective experience is objective, and also the abstraction of they, them is also equally objective, it seems
Yeah,
like.
maybe the problem has to do with subjectivity and objectivity, but I think probably in a more just a more persuasive case can be made if you think about concepts in terms of generalization and experience, intuition in terms of singularity.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I have an orange on my desk. When I called it an orange, you probably didn't immediately think it looked like this. And even if you did have a vague sort of spherical orange-ish colored thing, it probably didn't look exactly like this. After all, most of this is not really orange. There's a lot of like white and dark shadows and so on. You probably didn't see all the texture and all the uniqueness and individuality and singularity of exactly this experience at this time of this thing, right? The concept orange strips that all away. So a concept is general. Just because it's general, it doesn't actually capture the richness of an individual,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and I think that that's the problem, that concepts um, always sort of strip away the life. They always sort of strip away what really is there manifestly in our experience in the interest of some kind of transcendental or transcendent ideal of purity, right? So that, when you think orange, maybe what you had is in your mind just like a pure sphere of pure orange. But of course, this isn't pure in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all got all this detail and stuff in it, right? Um, and I think that that's what Adorno is talking about, where it's like when you think of yourself in terms of identities, you're not actually being true to what he calls the preponderance of the object, the fact that the object is always so much more than our conceptual analytical understanding of the object through concepts. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of other good stuff here, but maybe we can hold off for next time. Finish the article. I would like to talk a little bit about Kant because it's kind of significant. And also because there are ways that Bergson disagrees with Kant, but he doesn't necessarily disagree with Kant's methodology. He disagrees with the conclusions that Kant draws from his methodology. But the idea of like a transcendental argument is something we'll want to talk about next time. Because Deleuze kind of implicitly and then, I'm sorry, Bergson implicitly and then Deleuze really explicitly makes a transcendental argument, but they draw different conclusions from Kant. So we'll talk about that next time, okay? So finish the
Oh
article.
yeah, I have
Yeah.
one question.
Okay.
It's not related to this.
Okay.
Is Zoom okay for March 5th, or do I need a room?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think unless everybody else wants Zoom, I'd probably prefer to meet in person, but
Okay, and I mean, I
what
just
day of the week is that? Is that, um, did you say March 5th or March 1st? March 5th. Okay, yeah. Well, let me look up what day of the week that is. It is, oh wait, that's April. Oh, Friday. Okay. Oh,
Tuesday, right? March 5th.
wait. Oh, I'm in April. Okay. Yeah, I think I'd prefer to meet in person.
Okay, I'll just book the fishbowl or something like that.
Yeah, if it's open, just book whatever room you can.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we go? All right, finish the article. You know,
Right. Oh, next Monday or Tuesday?
oh, Mondays are good for me. We only pushed it to today because you sent the email. Monday okay with everybody? Same time? Yeah. 20 pages of Bergson is like 2 pages of Deleuze. So
Yeah.
I'm a little worried about how much we'll get through if we get into Deleuze, but anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.